1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My name is Andreas Werner. I'm a record producer, songwriter, and owner of Crazy Chester Records. The theme song you just heard is performed by Wet Willie's Jimmy Hall and Funky Chester. The Crazy Chester Radio Hour is a weekly music talk podcast featuring an eclectic group of guests with musical hearts, minds, and souls. And many of the episodes will dive deep into the rich history of music mecca Muscle Shoals. My guest today is Michael Gray. Michael is a curator at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum and has been responsible for many of its world-class exhibits, including exhibits on Ray Charles, Nashville's vast rhythm and blues history, and its most recent one, Dylan Cash and the Nashville Cats. Michael and I share a common love and fascination for all kinds of music, and especially Southern rhythm and blues and soul. Let me start off by quoting Nashville music journalist Craig Heavyhurst. He said, "The world knows Nashville because of people like Alan Jackson and Taylor Swift. Nashville knows itself because of people like Michael Gray." Today's guest, Michael Gray, is curator at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum here in Nashville. He's originally from Detroit and moved here when he was 18 years old, if I have my facts right. He soon started working at Phonolox Records on Nolensville Road, where he started to get immersed in the rich history of Nashville rhythm and blues. This led to him connecting with music entrepreneur and songwriter Ted Jarrett, who was one of the pivotal figures of Nashville R&B. This in turn led to him curating the exhibit Night Train to Nashville Music City Rhythm and Blues 1945 to 1970 at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. The exhibit's companion anthology record won the Grammy Award for Best Historic Compilation. He also curated exhibits on Ray Charles, the Bakersfield Sound, Sam Phillips, and the current exhibit Dylan Cash and the Nashville Cats. Please welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, Michael Gray.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andreas. I'm honored to be here.
Thanks for taking your time talking to me. Would you mind starting off describing a little bit what your work at the Country Music Hall of Fame entails?
Yeah, so my title at the Country Music Hall of Fame is Museum Editor, but that's not very descriptive. Mainly what I do is I curate exhibits and host public programs. Once we mount an exhibit, we do all kinds of panel discussions and concerts and Q&As and film screenings, to flesh out the story that we tell in the exhibit. And so I have the privilege of, helping put those together and in a lot of cases hosting those events or moderating the panels, So that's the majority of my job. At the museum, there's so many things going on that I have other duties as well, but curating exhibits and working on the public programs takes most of my time.
Okay, so why don't we go kind of back to the beginning? How did you initially get the music bug?
I'm originally from Detroit, and my parents had great taste in music. They came of age in the 50s, and so I was turned on to, Chuck Berry and a lot of Motown music. And by the time, I was getting into middle school and high school, I was really getting into rhythm and blues. So I was getting into like the superstars of the genre, the Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke and Ray Charles and Etta James, and eventually found my way to Solomon Burke and all that, and just loved that. Also was getting into jazz. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue record was the first jazz record I ever bought, and I would listen to a record like that and say, oh, who's that on saxophone? Oh, it's John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. So then I'd go out and buy records by them. And then, it would just keep going and going and
Yeah,
going to this
absolutely.
day. And so I really got into rhythm and blues, soul music, and jazz music. And when I moved to Nashville in 1987, I started working at Phonolux Records, as you mentioned. And the owner there is a British guy named Mike Smith, who has just a phenomenal record collection and has just wonderful, great taste in music. And by the time I was 18 years old, and when I started working at the store, I was playing some records by Arthur Alexander, the great, soul artist from Muscle Shoals. And Mike pointed out to me, I was naive, I didn't know, and he said, a lot of Arthur Alexander's records were made in Nashville, and I was brand new to town, I was young, I was, just not very well yet educated on the city's music history, and I was surprised, I didn't know that Nashville had, produced so much great R&B music, and so because I took an interest in Arthur Alexander recording in Nashville, Mike, took the initiative to point out a lot of other great R&B records that were made here as well. And I remember he would show me these 78 RPM records and these 45s, and not all of them, but a lot of them said produced and written by Ted Jarrett. And so, again, this is 1987. I'm in college at MTSU. And I was taking a folklore class from the great Charles Wolfe. And one of our assignments was to do an oral history interview with somebody. And Mike Smith at Phonolux said, why don't you see if Ted Jarrett's around and do your oral history interview with him, for your class project. And so I remember very vividly being on the campus of MTSU in Murfreesboro and going to a payphone and going to the white pages, the telephone book, and finding Theodore Jarrett, listed on Main Street in Nashville, and just cold calling him and explaining who I was and that I would love to do an interview with him. And it took him a minute to warm up to the idea, but then he had me over at his office there in East Nashville, and boy, that was a life-changing event for me. We spent hours talking, and he just opened up this whole new world to me of performers and songwriters and producers and studios and DJs and every name he was mentioning, I was like saying, oh man, I want to meet that person and interview that person. And at this point in my life, I didn't really know what I was going to do with it all. I knew it had sort of become this lost history, and I wanted to chronicle that history and let other people know about it. But I didn't really know exactly what I would do with it. But I knew that, in my record collection, I was keeping all the Nashville R&B stuff kind of in its own little section, in my music room. I was putting it all aside. Or anytime I ran across a magazine article or an obituary or any information that had to do with Nashville R&B, I was collecting all that and putting it in files and thinking, one day I want to do something with this, but didn't know what, And I was fortunate enough to get to hear some of Nashville's great R&B singers from the 50s and 60s. They were performing out. Marion James, Nashville's Queen of the Blues, would have these musicians reunions every Labor Day weekend where you could go and hear Earl Gaines and Roscoe Shelton and folks like that. And so I was getting to hear these people live. And then I got a job at the Nashville Banner newspaper, and this was I started there in 1995, and any chance I could get, I would write about the R&B artist whenever I could. I did a newspaper story on Ted Jarrett. I did, I remember Hank Crawford, the great jazz saxophonist who is from Memphis, but attended Tennessee State University in Nashville and got discovered by Ray Charles here. I did a story on him for the paper. Hoss Allen passed away, the great WLAC DJ. Hoss Allen died, and I wrote his obituary for the Banner. So any opportunity I had to write about these figures, I would. Never, ever dreaming that I would end up ultimately, doing the Night Train to Nashville project at the Country Music Hall of Fame. That was, years away from that, and never saw that coming. That was, but when I got to the Country Music Hall of Fame, we were in a meeting one day where we were just trying to decide, what major exhibit should go in this 5,000 square foot gallery that we have. And we were throwing different ideas, out, several of us. And there was another person working at the Country Music Hall of Fame by the name of Daniel Cooper. And I cannot exaggerate how important Dan Cooper has been to my life. This is a guy who's very, very bright and smart. He's also very quiet and humble, and doesn't do a lot of public speaking or public engagement. So sometimes he doesn't get the due he deserves because he's so quiet and behind the scenes. But he had also been very interested in the history of Nashville R&B and had been like writing liner notes for CD reissues and interviewing a lot of the artists. And he was working at the Country Music Hall of Fame at the same time, and we just kind of, the two of us sort of put together a proposal that we do the Night Train to Nashville exhibit at the museum, and it opened in 2004, and it was a 5,000 square foot exhibit. We put out 2 volumes of CDs. We put out 3 related books to the topic. We did a host of public programs. I'm thinking maybe 30, whether they be, concerts or panel discussions or Q&As or tribute concerts, just a load of those. And, one wonderful thing about the Country Music Hall of Fame is that you do have like all these platforms and outlets. It's not just a book or just a concert or just an exhibit, but you get to tell the story in so many ways.
Yeah, and I don't even know if there's anything comparable, certainly not here in town. I mean, I'm like, no matter what the exhibit is, it's just wonderful to see how much detail and how much work went into curating it, and how visually appealing it is too. That I find always interesting too, that whole side of, and you do a great job to do that. I mean, the current one, Dylan Cash and the Nashville Cats, is a very good example of that as well. And although I missed the original Night Train exhibit, I got a little taste of it. I got Ted Sherritt's book, which I highly recommend, and the book you guys put together with artifacts from the history. And you did some reunion concerts. I think you had a 5-year reunion at the museum one night. I came to that before I even moved here, and then the one a few years ago too. And it was just great to still see some of those great artists. And maybe just a little bit to educate some of our listeners about some of the recordings that were made here and that were maybe the most well known. Maybe you can just kind of mention a few.
Yeah, like Nashville R&B, and a lot of big hits came out of here. Buzz Cason and Mac Gaden wrote a song called Everlasting Love, which was originally recorded by Robert Knight, a singer from Franklin. And then that song is, lived on over the decades with, versions by Carl Carlton and U2 and Gloria Estefan and on, so that's one of the bigger R&B songs to ever, that's just got to be one of the biggest songs to ever come out of Nashville, period, And then Bobby Hebb wrote a song called Sunny that was all over the radio, in the summer of '66. It was so big that he got to open up for the Beatles on their final tour of America. And then over 500 artists have recorded that song, from Frank Sinatra and Count Basie to James Brown and Cher. It just goes, everybody, it's just become a standard. That's, one of the greatest singers to come out of the Nashville R&B scene was a guy named Gene Allison. And he had a song that was written and produced by Ted Jarrett called You Can Make It If You Try. And, the Rolling Stones ended up covering that song on their first album. So, there's also The Choking Kind by Joe Simon, which won a Grammy for Best R&B Song that year in
Harlan
'69.
Howard.
Yeah, it was written by Harlan. You know, in the Night Train exhibit, because we're the Country Music Hall of Fame, we felt like we should have one specific section of the exhibit that directly looked at the connections between R&B and country music in Nashville. And that's a perfect example. The Choking Kind, written by Harlan Howard, this great country music songwriter, the dean of Nashville songwriters. And it was originally recorded by Waylon Jennings, and then a couple of years later it was turned into an R&B hit by Joe Simon. So, you know, in the exhibit we had a place where you could hear a little bit of Waylon Jennings's version and hear Joe Simon's version, and you could listen to the the similarities and differences. And we did a number of songs that way.
Yeah. That's always been interesting to me too, and and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later too. But Muscle Shoals had a little bit of that connection too. Arthur Alexander had always a little bit of country in his. Another song I can think of is "Don't Take Her, She's All I Got," which Jerry Williams, Swamp Dogg, and Gary U.S. Bonds wrote as an R&B song, but then Johnny Paycheck had a huge hit, and other people too.
Yeah, it was originally recorded by Freddie North.
Yep.
And Freddie is still living in Nashville. He's a reverend now, and goes by his real name, Carpenter, Reverend Carpenter. And but yeah, you're right. He what the story on that song is very interesting. He recorded it, and the engineer on it was Billy Sherrill. This is the great country music producer that would go on to record Tammy Wynette and George Jones and Charlie Rich and Johnny Paycheck. And he was the engineer on Freddie North's original R&B version, and he knew he wanted to produce it on Johnny Paycheck, but he wanted to give Freddie North a little time to get his record out and give it a chance before Johnny Paycheck's version eclipsed it, and so he very intentionally held back Johnny Paycheck's record for a while so that Freddie North would have a chance to to get some airplay and have some legs of its own before the Paycheck version came out. So
and some other kind of side stories that people always like to hear. One of them is certainly Jimi Hendrix kind of getting his start around here too. Can you maybe just touch on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. Of course, Jimi Hendrix was originally from Seattle, but he moved to Nashville or Middle Tennessee in 1961. It was actually because he was a part of the, he was at Fort Campbell. He was stationed at Fort Campbell on the Tennessee-Kentucky border, and that's where he met Billy Cox, his bass player. And they would play around the Clarksville area, but then they would make trips to Nashville and play around the city here. And then after they got out of the Army, Jimmy and Billy both moved to Nashville. Jimmy lived on Jefferson Street, and I guess a lot of historians would say that this is where he became like a workaday guitarist, where he really learned the trade. He was in a house band at the Del Morocco, in a band called the King Casuals. He used to play Printer's Alley. He looked up to a local guitar player here named Johnny Jones. Johnny was like Nashville's premier blues guitarist, and apparently, Jimmy would kind of like follow him around and watch him play and learn from him. And there's a famous story where them two got into like a famous guitar duel, and that Jimmy left with his tail between his legs because Johnny just outpowered him, So
and just a couple more stories around Nashville R&B, but another side of Nashville R&B, and you mentioned Hoss Allen earlier briefly, is not just the recording of R&B here, but also the radio station WLAC that people could pretty much hear all over the country, and in that matter influenced a lot of musicians and people. Can you touch on that legacy a little bit?
Yeah, you can't overstate the importance of WLAC. I kind of say WLAC was to R&B what WSM is to country music. WSM, the station of the Grand Ole Opry, turned, people all over the nation onto to country music, and that's what WLAC did for R&B. And it was, this is at a time, they started playing black music at night in 1946. Was a DJ named Gene Noble who, the story is that some black students came to WLAC and said, will you play some of our kind of music? And I think it was like Boogie Woogie records and that kind of thing. And Gene started playing some of them on the air, and they just got a great response. People started writing into the station saying, we want to hear more of that. And so you had these, basically you had these white older DJs like John Richburg and Gene Nobles and Hoss Allen and Herman Grizzard. They were white, but most listeners thought they were black, and a lot of it was because they would kind of talk in a jive talk, and there's a lot of funny stories of listeners meeting the DJs for the first time and surprised, that they were white. But, again, they were playing this music when it was sort of taboo to do so. They weren't the only station playing R&B music in the 40s, but they were the only station that had that much power. They were a 50,000 watt clear channel station. They could be heard in Canada, they could be heard in Jamaica. If you go and read the autobiographies or biographies of James Brown and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and B.B. King and others, I mean, they'll tell you that how important WLAC was to their careers. That in a lot of cases, it was WLAC was the first powerful station to play their records.
Yeah, and we're here at Creative Workshop Recording Studio that's owned by Buzz Cason, and he's the original owner. He opened it in 1970. And you mentioned him earlier, him and Mac Gaden, and the song Everlasting Love. Maybe, if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about Buzz's role in Nashville R&B, or Buzz Max and some other people like Charlie McCoy, who were like, these white kids, if you will, just being in love with that kind of music, but then becoming very important players.
Yeah, absolutely. Buzz and Mac, and for that matter, Charlie McCoy, they were just ate up with R&B. Charlie McCoy is the great harmonica player, and he was mainly listening to blues harp, and then with Mac and Buzz, they were just local Nashville kids, just ate up with R&B. They were going to R&B shows, I know Buzz Cason's told me stories about like going to see like an R&B review show like at the Ryman in the 1950s when it was a segregated audience, and working his way backstage and getting to meet the performers, and and then in Buzz's case, he ended up writing the song Soldier of Love, which I first heard by Arthur Alexander. Again, Arthur Alexander was so important he was sort of my introduction to the Nashville R&B, and then that song ended up, the Beatles ended up recording that song, and Marshall Crenshaw and others. And, Mac Gaden has an interesting story. He, as a teenager, worked at Ernie's Record Mart, which was one of the main sponsors on WLAC. It was, a record store on 3rd Avenue, owned by Ernie Young. And again, he would sell the records mainly by mail order, over WLAC. And then he started, the same guy that had the record shop, Ernie, also started Excello Records, which becomes one of the most, important R&B and blues labels in the history of that music. And so, Mac and Buzz were entrenched, in this from a very young age, from their teens, Yeah.
You mentioned Soldier of Love too, and one thing you might know already, but if not, you will like it. Donnie Fritz is working on an Arthur Alexander tribute album, and that's one of the songs he cut for it too.
Wonderful.
Among other songs, and especially also songs that Donnie wrote with Arthur, because the two of them were really tight. But anyway, and we could keep talking about this side of Nashville forever, I think, but I would just like to maybe finish it off with one thing. You mentioned that you guys did 2 compilation albums connected to the exhibit, and the first one actually won a Grammy. And would you mind maybe sharing a little bit how the curation or creation of that project came about?
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, one wonderful thing about the museum at the Country Music Hall of Fame is not only do we have the exhibit space, but we know that we can't tell the whole story just in the exhibit gallery. And thankfully, we can flesh out those stories with CDs and books and magazine articles and podcasts and public programs. And so, we decided early on that we were going to put out a CD set with the Night Train exhibit. So it was a 2 CD set. And on that one, we made sure that we covered, all the milestone songs. So on that CD, you're going to get Sunny and You Can Make It If You Try and Everlasting Love and all those are on there. And it got, we put that out with the record label Lost Highway, which is part of the Universal Music Group. So they're the ones that actually manufactured the CD and distributed it. The Hall of Fame staff, Daniel Cooper and me, chose the songs and wrote the liner notes and did all the programming. But then we turned it over to Lost Highway and they manufactured it and got it into stores. And one big boost it got was that the TV show CBS Sunday Morning did a summer special where they listed their 5 favorite albums of the year so far. The idea was okay, people are about to go on their summer road trips. Here's 5 CDs to take with you on the road. And their number one pick was the Night Train to Nashville compilation. And they did a 5-minute story about it on primetime TV. And the next thing we know, it was the number one seller on Amazon.com for a little while. It was outpacing big records by the Beastie Boys and REM just for a few days right after that CBS morning news piece ran. And then when it got the Grammy nomination, we were up against Johnny Cash shortly after he had passed away, and some other big records were nominated in the same category. So I just went out to Los Angeles to the Grammys. Really, truly, this is not false humility. I really just thought, okay, well, Johnny Cash or somebody else will win, but I'm going to go out and have fun, and wasn't feeling any pressure, And then, sure enough, they called our name, and just this was during the pre-televised award show, and then I just remember, while accepting the Grammy, thanking all the Nashville R&B, artists and hoping that that some of them were finally getting their due,
Yeah, and I remember you actually got me the certificate for Harrison Calloway because you couldn't track him down, or you were not able to give it to him, and I gave it to him, and that that made his day. I mean, week, month probably, and I was so glad to see that that they got to get a piece of the action too. I think that certainly meant a lot.
Yeah. And just one other thing I'd like to say about the Night Train project is, it opened in 2004, and the museum, the Country Music Hall of Fame, had just moved from Music Row to downtown, and we were millions of dollars, in debt because of the construction of the new building, and there was a lot of pressure put on our senior staff. And I got to thank them and give them credit for rolling with this exhibit. I mean, it was risky for the Country Music Hall of Fame to devote half of its second floor to telling the R&B story in Nashville. And I remember the staff sort of asking the tough question, most of all of the historians and curators working on the exhibit were white, and I remember asking ourselves, should we be the ones telling this story? Should this white staff be telling the African American story? But I guess my feeling at the time was that nobody else was. I mean, since then, a lot of things have developed. There's the National Museum of African American Music is coming on board, and there's lots of other things happening to tell this story and to preserve this music. But at the time, there really wasn't much. I remember we had just lost the great singer Roscoe Shelton, and I'm thinking, okay, these singers and songwriters are starting to pass away, and this history is, getting lost, and that if nobody else is, maybe we should, And so I'll just applaud our my bosses who let us. Who had the confidence to let us do this exhibit.
Yeah, and another exhibit you were involved in that goes a little bit down similar road is the Ray Charles exhibit, where you guys highlighted his country and western recordings. Can you just touch a little bit on that exhibit?
Yeah, it was a natural follow-up to Night Train to Nashville. Ray had just passed away. The movie Ray with Jamie Foxx had just come out, and the folks that run his estate in Los Angeles basically approached us and said, "Would you be interested in doing an exhibit?" And of course, to us, it was a no-brainer. I mean, Ray Charles was so important. I mean, he was so influenced by country music and then had such an impact on country music, particularly with his 1962 album, Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which had the big hit, I Can't Stop Loving You. And so, anytime we do a figure that's as big as Ray Charles, it's kind of like, well, what can we bring to the table? Like his life had been so well chronicled, his story was so well known, but we felt like, well, being the Country Music Hall of Fame, we really, really took that country music angle on Ray and talked, half the exhibit was about how he grew up listening to country music and listening to the Opry, and one of his very first bands, in Florida was, a country band, and how he started, making country records. Even for Atlantic Records, he did the song "I'm Moving On," the Hank Snow song, even before the Modern Sounds in Country and Western record came along. So we talked about how he was influenced by country, and then we talked about how he brought a whole new audience to country music in the '60s, and so that was a fun exhibit to work on. Yeah.
Yeah, and then later you did an exhibit that was talking about the history of country music from Bakersfield, the Central Valley area of California. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. We opened an exhibit in 2012. It was called The Bakersfield Sound, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, and California Country. And, we had, Buck Owens and Merle Haggard are both members of the Country Music Hall of Fame. And our staff at different times had suggested, oh, maybe we should do an exhibit on Buck Owens, and later, oh, maybe we should do an exhibit, we should do an exhibit on Merle Haggard. But then we thought, you know what, it would actually be more interesting to do a full exhibit on Bakersfield and that music scene that they both came out of, and just to kind of look at the context that their creative talent, wasn't in a vacuum, that there was this whole music scene happening there in Bakersfield, in the 50s and 60s. And, how did that one town, end up becoming, so rich with music, and not only with Buck and Merle, but with folks like Red Simpson and Bonnie Owens, and Wynn Stewart played a lot there, and Tommy Collins, and so there was this whole community of great musicians who came out of there, and we just kind of wanted to look at like how did all that take place. And so one highlight of that exhibit, I will say, is that it opened in 2012, just about the time that Merle Haggard was turning 75. And one of the highlights of my career was that I got to interview Merle Haggard in the Ford Theater there at the Hall of Fame, right the weekend of his 75th birthday. So,
yeah, that was great. And you also got to work on an exhibit about one of the fathers of rock and roll, or the father of rock and roll, how he's known, Sam Phillips. And can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of the exhibits I'm very proud of. First of all, I got to work on that exhibit with the great Peter Guralnick, who's a hero of mine. Peter Guralnick is probably, the greatest writer, author on American music. And, I've been reading him since high school and had gotten to know him over the years. And of course, he's got a full-length biography on Sam Phillips, and he's probably the leading expert on Elvis, and so to get to work on the Sam Phillips exhibit with Peter, that alone was wonderful. But then, again, one thing I'm glad about the Hall of Fame is that we didn't just tell the country rockabilly part of the story. I mean, of course, Sam Phillips is most famous for discovering Elvis and Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis and Charlie Rich. Sorry, but before that, before he was recording the white artist, he opened the Memphis Recording Services, his studio in Memphis. He opened it to record blues artists, and he was the one that first recorded B.B. King and Howlin' Wolf and Ike Turner, yeah, all those artists, Roscoe Gordon, and so they were those artists, those blues artists were as featured nearly as prominently as the white rockabilly artists in that exhibit. So.
Yeah, and Peter had a book and a documentary about it too that you screened one day a few years before, I think, at Ford Theater too, and that's how I got to see it. I don't know if it's ever been released, but you did a screening there at the museum, and that was fascinating too. And obviously there's a Muscle Shoals connection there too with him growing up in Florence, Alabama. So that's one thing, and like going down the rabbit hole or whatever and listening to records, looking at record covers, discovering all the connections and the intersections. That's something that's always fascinated me, and I bet that's a big part of what you do every day. It's kind of, uncover those connections and kind of highlight some of that. And
absolutely. I mean, I love that I get to learn so much in my job. I mean, the last thing I try to ever do is like approach it as a know-it-all. I go into it like, man, I'm going to learn so much more about this person or this artist or this music scene. I don't, I have so much more to learn. And thankfully I have one of these jobs where, my livelihood and my passion and my hobby kind of intersect, and I just get to go to work every day and learn more about this music. And,
yeah. Question here too. I mean, I always feel you're learning every day, and you certainly never learn out. There's always more to learn. And you mentioned a few people that, although you might have not mentioned the word mentors, but might have been mentors to you. In my case, people like Buzz here, or Mickey Buckins, or David Hood, or I just feel I can learn so much from them by just being around them and being inspired, and them, teaching you stuff. Who are some of your mentors or people that have shaped the way you operate?
Yeah, well, Jay Orr. Jay Orr is my boss at the Country Music Hall of Fame, and this is our third job together. He hired me out of college to be a music writer at the Nashville Banner newspaper, and then that was Nashville's afternoon paper, and it got bought out by the Tennessean or Gannett in '98, and then we both went out to CMT for a little while, and then we both ended up at the Hall of Fame in 2002. So that was our third job. Going to the Hall of Fame was our third job together, and boy, he's been a mentor. I mean, he's a great editor, but I've learned it's more than just syntax and grammar that I've learned from Jay. He, when I first started working with him, I was in my early 20s and didn't know that many people in the music business, and he just introduced me to folks and just kind of just showed me the ropes about everything. I mean, I owe him so much, and he is like just one of the most even-tempered guys I've ever met in my entire life, and just couldn't ask for a better boss. So he's been super important in my life. I think I mentioned Charles Wolf. He was one of my professors at MTSU. He's one of the reasons that I came to Nashville. Is he was a famous folklorist and had written books on people like Leadbelly, and I knew he was teaching at MTSU, and I wanted to come study under him. Mike Smith at Phonolux Records just turned me on to so many good records. That guy's just got great ears, and his record collection just goes so deep that he's literally never turned me on to a bad record, And so, I mean, there are a lot of others, but but those three come immediately to mind.
And earlier you also mentioned Peter Grolnick as, writer, music historian, scholar. Can you tell me a little bit how you got to meet him and a little more about your collaboration?
Yeah, well, I've been reading Peter Grolnick's books since high school. His book, Sweet Soul Music, in particular, had a huge influence on me. That book came out, I think, when I was like in 11th grade in high school, and here he was writing about all this great Southern soul music, and I knew it. At that time, I knew a lot of the big names in soul music, but didn't know like a lot of the behind the scenes folks. For instance, I knew songs like Dark End of the Street and I'm Your Puppet and Do Right Woman, Do Right Man, but in 11th grade, I didn't make the connection that all three of those songs were written or co-written by Dan Penn. But reading Peter's book, just educated me to those kinds of things. And so I've been a fan of his work for years and have relied on his research for years. And first met him, I think in the early 90s, but then really got to know him like the last 12 years because Peter, though he lives in Massachusetts, he was hired by Vanderbilt University as a writer in residence, and he was coming here every spring to teach classes at Vanderbilt. And at the Hall of Fame, we're no fools. We knew that if Peter Grolnick was in town and living here, that we should partner with him on things. And so literally every year we would have him do some kind of presentation at the museum. So he's in our Ford Theater there at the museum, he's come and done talks on Elvis Presley and Colonel Tom Parker and Ray Charles and Solomon Burke and Sam Phillips and Ray Charles and and others. And he was, while he was doing his stint at Vanderbilt, he was also working on a major biography of Sam Phillips. And so we timed it so that when his Sam Phillips book was about to be published, we would open up a major exhibit on Sam Phillips at the Country Music Hall of Fame. And Peter was a guest co-curator of that exhibit with us. And so, man, what a treat to get to work with him on any exhibit, but especially one on Sam Phillips. I mean, man, that guy is behind so much of the greatest music. Not only the rockabilly artists like Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash, and Charlie Rich, but also, Sam first opened his studio in Memphis to record blues. He was recording Ike Turner and B.B. King and Little Milton and, all these great artists, Roscoe Gordon. And so, the exhibit really focused as much on the R&B and blues stuff as the country. And on a personal note, also I'll add that the way I even got into country music was through rockabilly. My mom, both my parents liked Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis, and that was kind of my gateway into country music to begin with. So it was a real treat to get to work on an exhibit on Sam Phillips.
Yeah, and just to cap off the exhibits you've been responsible for, always with a great team. I know that. But the current exhibit, which is just outstanding in so many ways, is called Dylan Cash and the Nashville Cats. Would you mind talking about that some?
Yeah, so I had, or I should say our staff, different people on staff had been pitching the idea of doing something on Dylan for a long time. Dylan made 3.5 records in Nashville in the late 60s, starting with Blonde on Blonde, and was working with a lot of the Nashville musicians like Charlie McCoy and Wayne Moss and Kenny Butchery and Matt Gaden and folks like that. And we'd been pitching the idea of doing something, didn't know exactly how it would shake out. And I remember pitching the Dylan exhibit right after we did Night Train to Nashville and Ray Charles, thinking, maybe Dylan could come after Ray Charles, so this would have been, like around 2008 or so, and one of my bosses, Carolyn Tate, she was so wise. She said, I kind of like the idea of doing something on Dylan, but she didn't like the trajectory of it following Night Train and Ray Charles. She said, we need to do something squarely down the middle, hard country. We don't want to like make it look like country music is only important or good because Ray Charles and Bob Dylan like it, And so following the Ray Charles exhibit, we did one on Hank Williams. And then we did the Bakersfield one with, Buck and Merle. That's as country as you can get. Then it was like, okay, now it's time to maybe to do the Dylan exhibit, And so we opened that exhibit in 2005. It's been up for 3 years. It's going to close in February 2018. And again, like I said about Ray Charles is such a big figure. It was like, well, what can the Country Music Hall of Fame bring to the table that hasn't already been said, And in Dylan's case, he's one of the most analyzed, chronicled musician in all of popular music. But we thought, well, let's look at Dylan's recordings through the lens of the Nashville Cats. And so we tell the story of how Dylan ended up in Nashville in the first place and how that was surprising to people in 1966 for this New York hipster, to be in Nashville. Because Nashville at that time would have been, considered a, conservative backwater, just country town. So what's a New York hipster like Dylan doing there? But, he starts making a masterpiece like Blonde on Blonde and people, and John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline, and people are hearing this and going, wow, I mean, if Dylan's going there and making these great records, maybe we should think about going there too. And so all these other rock and folk artists started pouring in, from the Byrds and Leonard Cohen and Joan Baez and Linda Ronstadt and, Neil Young. And I mean, it just goes on. And they were all coming to Nashville to work with the same small group of musicians. And like, 25 musicians, the same ones are on all these records. And we also look at Johnny Cash as a part of the story because he had this, network TV show. The premiere episode had Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell on it. And, he had Pete Seeger and Neil Young and lots of other rock and folk artists on there, and he was sort of helping bridge a lot of those cultural and generational gaps between like the old guard, Nashville, and basically the hippies who were coming in to start making music here.
On the current exhibit, you partnered with Pete Finney to curate the exhibit. Can you elaborate a little bit on you guys' relationship?
Yes, Pete Finney, is a great steel guitarist in town, and when I moved to Nashville in 1987. He was one of the first people to show me the ropes around town. He took me to he was the first person to ever take me to the Grand Ole Opry, and he knew I was real into jazz music, and he was like turning me on to like a lot of Western swing music, saying, well, if you like jazz, then listen to these Bob Wills records because it's basically a lot of the same kind of music. And Pete started coming into the Hall of Fame's library and was starting to do research on a book about Dylan when Dylan came to Nashville. And our staff had been sort of kicking around some ideas about doing something on the albums that Dylan made in Nashville, Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. And so, Pete was coming in and doing all that tedious research, going through all the discographies and magazines, and really putting the hours and the sweat into the research. And it was like we just went to Pete and said, we've been thinking about doing something on Dylan. You've been doing research on Dylan. Why don't we team up and partner? And so we basically hired Pete Finney as a guest curator to work with us on the Dylan Cash Cats exhibit. And so he was very, very important to that whole process, and gave us some perspectives on the story that I don't think we would have arrived at on our own. So that was great having Pete involved with that exhibit.
Yeah, and one thing I like too about that exhibit is you got Dylan and Cash as like the marquee names, but in many ways he shines a spotlight on Nashville Cats, which are, these behind the scenes figures that have been so important to this town, and they played on a lot of country records too. But besides that, and kind of from there, I would like to touch a little bit on a couple of series you guys are producing at the Country Music Hall of Fame. One of them is called Nashville Cats, where you guys honor those players and interview them in front of the public, and it's always really nicely done. And Bill Lloyd does a lot of that. And you are in charge of one called Poets and Prophets, where you guys honor the songwriters. Can you tell us a little bit about Poets and Prophets?
Yeah, so the Nashville Cats series started in 2006 with Bill Lloyd interviewing the great pedal steel guitarist Lloyd Green. And basically with that, he would sit down, a significant behind the scenes musician and talk to them for like an hour and a half. And, we would always incorporate vintage video clips and have them demonstrate their instruments some and perform and just kind of really go dig deep into their career. And so the Nashville Cats series went so well that my boss Jay Orr, within a few months said, oh, well, we need to do the same kind of series, but do it with songwriters instead of studio musicians. So the Nashville Cats series focuses on studio musicians, and then the songwriting series is called Poets and Prophets, Salute to Legendary Songwriters. And we launched that in 2007, and I've had the privilege of doing all those interviews. We've been doing it for 10 years and about to do the 40th interview in that series. Later this year, it kicked off with the great songwriter Hank Cochran, and then we went and did John D. Loudermilk and Bobby Braddock and Bob McDill and Whitey Schaefer, and through the years we've done Buzz Cason, we've done Jimmy Webb, Dan Penn. It's been just a joy to work on those programs, and I kind of look at it like it serves two purposes. On one hand, it gives the Hall of Fame a chance to shine a spotlight and honor the achievements of these great songwriters. But as a museum, it also gives us a chance to collect a great interview, because we have these interviews, or they're done in front of a live audience, but they're professionally filmed, and then those films will live in our archive forever. So 100 years from now, if somebody wants to write a book on Nashville songwriting, they're going to have 40 interviews, 40 long, lengthy interviews to look at. Or if someone wants to do a book on Dan Penn, well, we've got an interview with him in the can that people can come and watch.
Yeah, that is great. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast too, for the very same reason, to be able to capture all these great stories and all these, kind of about all these great people in music, and especially the ones that otherwise might be not as much covered. It's not as you said before, Bob Dylan has been chronicled a lot. You can go out there and find pretty much anything, but some of those people that act more behind the scenes, it's certainly harder to obtain that information. And one thing I like too, kind of almost a trend here more recently, I guess, we mentioned Ted Sherritt's book, but Buzz Cason did a book, Matt Gaten did a book, Charlie McCoy, Wayne Moss, different other people, and I'm really glad that there are a lot of people, and sometimes those artists and musicians themselves, who actually took the initiative to contribute to the material that's available. Yeah. And we're almost at the end here, but is there anything we kind of haven't touched on that you would like to share?
No, I mean, I thank you for taking the time to do this and let me tell a little bit of my story. And I just love Nashville. And I mean, I moved here 30 years ago, and just have never thought about leaving. This town never ceases to amaze me. Like every night of the week you can go out and hear good music, and I just want to keep myself open to hearing hearing things I haven't heard before and meeting new people, and I'm glad to have a job that lets me do that, and I'm glad to have friends like you that they're always constantly turning me on to great music as well.
Yeah, well, thank you too, because vice versa, I've learned so much on those Poets and Prophets interviews. You did it with all these great people, and it's always, I would like to encourage anybody to go and check those out, or go to you guys' archive. Is there any other, can you talk just a little bit about what's going on at the Hall of Fame now and maybe the next year or so, just to kind of, if anybody else would be interested to come here and check it out?
Yeah, I mean, well, at the museum, we're constantly, changing exhibits, keeping things fresh, doing hundreds of public programs a year. Not only the Poets and Prophets and the Nashville Cats, but literally every single Saturday we have a songwriter perform. Every Sunday we have a professional musician do a instrument demonstration, and there's just so much going on there. We're always trying to keep it fresh and giving people a reason to keep coming back. And so yeah, just you can always go to our website and at the countrymusichollofame.org and get a handle on what's happening there.
Yeah, that's great, and I can encourage anybody to go and check it out. And it's just getting better and better too. You just had, I don't know, almost doubled your exhibit space within the last few years.
Yep, and we're breaking attendance records. The last 2 or 3 years, we've had over 1 million people come through the museum each year. So, which is
and your new CMA theater is spectacular too. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Country Music Hall of Fame too. So. Yeah, well, anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I just wish you the best of luck with everything in life.
Thank you, Andreas.
This was the 12th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We taped it at Buzz Cason's legendary Creative Workshop recording studio in the Berry Hill neighborhood of Nashville. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next week.